When we examine the recent exchange between former President Donald Trump and Iran's supreme leader, it is easy to focus narrowly on the dramatic rhetoric, the warnings, the threats, the headlines that scream of imminent conflict. Yet, if we step back and analyze this interaction from a systemic perspective, what becomes clear is that such rhetoric is never isolated. It is deeply intertwined with global political and economic structures. The words of leaders carry weight far beyond the immediate moment, influencing markets, diplomatic relations, and even the calculations of other nations watching closely from the sidelines. Every statement made in this context functions as a signal, not only to the adversary directly involved, but to a web of actors connected through alliances, trade, and shared interests. Trump's response to Iran's warning is particularly significant because it operates within a highly interconnected international system. In today's world, geopolitical moves are rarely purely symbolic. They have cascading effects that touch energy markets, military alliances, and financial systems. For example, when rhetoric escalates between these two nations, it immediately impacts oil prices, investment flows, and regional security calculations. Investors and policymakers interpret these statements as indicators of potential risk, adjusting their strategies accordingly. In this sense, the language of political leaders becomes a form of economic signaling, shaping decisions in arenas that at first glance seem unrelated to the initial threat or warning. Moreover, these exchanges contribute to the broader perception of power and influence on the global stage. Nations, particularly those with strategic interests in the Middle East, monitor every word and gesture, looking for signs of resolve, weakness, or unpredictability. Trump's response, assertive and uncompromising, is designed to communicate strength, projecting an image of control and authority. However, such signals are inherently double edged. While they may reassure some allies of commitment and resolve, they also risk escalating tensions, triggering counter responses that could destabilize the region. The rhetoric itself becomes a tool of influence capable of shaping the behavior of states, non state actors, and even international institutions. It is also important to recognize that rhetoric in this context functions as a feedback mechanism. The response from Iran is shaped not only by its own strategic calculations, but also by expectations of how the US will react. Leaders operate in a loop where statements and counterstatements generate a dynamic interplay of action and reaction. This iterative process amplifies the global significance of each message, turning what might seem like a simple warning into a complex signal that reverberates through political, economic, and social networks worldwide. Finally, the global implications of such rhetoric extend to public perception and domestic politics. Citizens within both countries and beyond interpret these exchanges in ways that can influence policy support, national unity, and political legitimacy. Media coverage amplifies this effect, framing the narrative in terms of confrontation, diplomacy, or crisis. Consequently, the rhetoric of leaders like Trump and Iran's supreme leader is not merely performative, it is a structural component of the international system, shaping perceptions, influencing behavior, and generating tangible consequences across multiple dimensions of global interaction. When analyzing Trump's response to Iran's supreme leader, it is essential to look beyond the surface level drama of threats and statements and consider the underlying economic and strategic interests that drive such rhetoric. In international relations, Words are rarely neutral. They serve as tools of leverage within a broader system of global power and economic control. Trump's assertive response is a clear example of how political messaging is intertwined with the pursuit of national and even personal strategic objectives. Every statement, whether framed as a warning, criticism, or challenge, communicates intentions regarding resources, influence, and positioning in the global hierarchy. One of the most immediate economic factors at play in US Iran tensions is the control and stability of energy markets. Iran possesses significant oil reserves, and any escalation between the two countries can directly affect global oil prices, supply chains, and the strategies of multinational energy companies. Trump's rhetoric, therefore, functions not only as a political signal but also as an economic maneuver, signaling to both allies and competitors that the US maintains leverage over critical resources. Markets respond quickly to perceived instability in the Middle East, and strong rhetoric can serve to reassure investors aligned with US interests while discouraging engagement by rivals who might exploit tensions to their advantage. Strategically, Trump's statements also reflect broader geopolitical calculations. By publicly addressing Iran's warning, he reinforces US influence in the region and signals to other Middle Eastern powers that the US remains actively engaged and willing to assert dominance. This is particularly relevant in a region where alliances are fluid and rivalries complex. The rhetoric becomes a form of soft power, shaping perceptions and deterring actions that could undermine US interests. At the same time, it serves as a message to domestic audiences projecting strength, decisiveness, and the ability to defend national interests, which can have significant political ramifications at home. Moreover, the interplay between economic control and strategic influence is not coincidental, it is structural. Nations operate within systems where economic strength underpins military and political power. Trump's response must therefore be read as part of a larger strategy that aligns economic leverage with geopolitical signaling. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and diplomatic pressure are all instruments that, when combined with rhetorical assertiveness, form a toolkit for maintaining influence. The words spoken in these public exchanges are calculated to maximize the impact of that toolkit without necessarily resorting to direct military confrontation, highlighting the sophisticated interdependence of economic and strategic interests. It is also important to recognize the global audience that interprets these statements. Allies, adversaries, and international institutions all observe and respond to US positioning. A strong response signals to partners that the US is committed to protecting its interests while simultaneously cautioning rivals against aggressive maneuvers. This dual audience, both domestic and international, reinforces the strategic utility of rhetoric as a form of communication that extends far beyond immediate bilateral relations. Trump's statements, therefore, cannot be understood merely as personal posturing. They are deliberate interventions into a complex system of economic and political leverage designed to maintain US dominance and shape outcomes in the global arena. When examining Trump's response to Iran's supreme leader, it is critical to recognize that leaders do not operate in a vacuum. Every action, every statement, every public declaration is shaped and constrained by systemic forces that extend beyond the immediate personalities involved. The United States and Iran, despite their differences in power and global influence, both function within complex structures, political, economic, and social, that limit and channel their choices. Understanding these systemic constraints allows us to see why rhetoric, while dramatic and headline grabbing, is often a strategic navigation of pressures that are far larger than the leaders themselves. At the core of these constraints are economic realities. No nation, regardless of military might, can ignore the imperatives of finance, trade, and resource management. For the US, maintaining global economic dominance requires careful management of markets, alliances, and sanctions. Trump's response, therefore, must be interpreted in light of these economic levers. Every word signals potential policy actions, which in turn influence currency stability, energy markets, and investor confidence. Similarly, Iran faces its own set of economic constraints. International sanctions, domestic economic pressures, and dependency on oil exports create limits on how it can respond to external threats. These economic structures dictate not only what is possible, but also what is strategically wise, turning public statements into calculated maneuvers within a broader system. Political systems themselves impose additional layers of constraint. In democratic nations like the US, leaders must consider domestic opinion, party politics, and institutional checks and balances. Trump's rhetoric is carefully calibrated to resonate with supporters, satisfy political allies, and demonstrate leadership strength, all while operating within the bounds of existing policy frameworks and international law. Iran, governed by a complex mix of religious authority, political institutions, and revolutionary ideology, faces similarly rigid structures. The supreme leader's warnings are not simply personal reactions, they are shaped by the expectations of the political elite, military advisors, and the broader population. In both cases, systemic pressures transform what might appear as spontaneous or emotional responses into structured strategic communication. Military and strategic realities further constrain action. Both nations understand that escalation carries enormous risks: regional destabilization, unintended casualties, and global backlash. Leaders must weigh the immediate political gains of assertive rhetoric against long term security consequences. This balancing act is dictated not by personality alone, but by the systemic logic of deterrence and risk management. Actions are therefore mediated by the structural realities of international power, alliances, and defense capabilities, making rhetoric both a weapon and a signal of careful calculation. Finally, the media ecosystem amplifies these systemic pressures. Leader statements are filtered through global news networks, social media platforms, and public discourse, shaping perception in ways that can constrain or empower further actions. Every word is measured against expected reactions from multiple audiences, reinforcing the systemic nature of political decision making. Trump's response, like Iran's warning, is thus not merely a personal assertion of power. It is a strategic engagement with multiple structural forces that define the range of possible actions, the risks they entail, and the impact they can achieve across economic, political, and military domains. To fully understand Trump's response to Iran's supreme leader, it is essential to situate this exchange within the broader historical context of US Iran relations. The current rhetoric is not a standalone event. It is the latest moment in a long series of confrontations, negotiations, sanctions, and conflicts that have defined the relationship between these two nations for decades. From the 1953 CIA backed coup in Iran to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, from the Iran Iraq War to the imposition of decades long sanctions, The historical backdrop provides critical insight into why both sides communicate the way they do today. History has created patterns, expectations, and strategic behaviors that shape how leaders respond to warnings, threats, and provocations. Trump's response reflects a continuation of a long standing pattern of U.S. policy toward Iran: assertive, often confrontational, and aimed at signaling strength both domestically and internationally. Previous administrations have alternated between diplomacy and pressure, using sanctions, negotiations, and military posturing as tools to influence Iranian behavior. Trump's rhetoric, while framed in the language of personal resolve and direct challenge, is deeply consistent with this historical pattern. It is part of a cycle in which Iran tests U.S. resolve, the U.S. responds with public and private signals of deterrence, and both sides navigate a careful dance to avoid escalation into open conflict while maintaining political credibility. Iran, too, operates within historical constraints and legacies. The memory of foreign intervention, sanctions, and repeated pressure has created a national strategy that prioritizes sovereignty, deterrence, and the projection of internal and regional influence. The Supreme Leader's warning is a reflection of these historical experiences, designed to communicate to the US and the world that Iran is willing to assert its strategic position while leveraging decades of geopolitical lessons. This historical lens helps explain why rhetoric often escalates, even when concrete military action is not imminent. Both nations are acting in accordance with strategies shaped by memory, precedent, and institutionalized approaches to conflict. Furthermore, historical context reveals the structural reasons why rhetoric is so consequential. Past crises have demonstrated that words can have real world consequences, shaping international perception, affecting markets, and triggering alliances or conflicts. US Iran confrontations have repeatedly shown that escalation, even verbal, can shift regional dynamics, influence global energy markets, and provoke responses from neighboring powers. Leaders are acutely aware of these historical outcomes, and their communications are calibrated to signal resolve without necessarily initiating full scale military engagement. History teaches both sides the cost of miscalculation, the utility of signaling, and the strategic advantage of using rhetoric to achieve political objectives without crossing thresholds that could spiral into war. By situating Trump's response within this historical continuum, it becomes clear that the exchange is far more than a simple reaction to a warning. It is a moment in a long narrative of conflict, negotiation, and strategic signaling. Understanding this context allows observers to see the patterns underlying current behavior, to recognize the structural and institutional factors guiding decision making, and to appreciate the ways in which history informs contemporary strategies in the delicate balance between confrontation and diplomacy as we observe the latest exchange between Trump and Iran's supreme leader. It is crucial to approach these events not simply as a sequence of headlines, but as an opportunity for critical analysis. In the modern media environment, political rhetoric is often sensationalized, framed to provoke emotional reactions rather than thoughtful reflection. Yet beneath the surface level drama lie structural questions about power, strategy, and consequences that demand careful examination. A critical perspective allows us to move beyond the immediate spectacle and consider the broader implications for global stability, economic security, and the lived experiences of people both within and beyond the nations directly involved. At the heart of this approach is the recognition that words and statements by world leaders are not isolated actions. They are embedded in complex systems of political, economic, and social forces. Trump's response, while framed as assertive and decisive, is shaped by domestic political pressures, global economic interests, and strategic considerations in the Middle East. Similarly, Iran's warning reflects internal political structures, historical experiences with foreign intervention, and regional ambitions. By critically analyzing these communications, we can uncover the underlying incentives, constraints, and objectives that guide the behavior of powerful actors in international politics. This perspective encourages citizens to see beyond the personalities involved and focus on the systemic dynamics at play. Furthermore, critical analysis requires attention to the consequences of rhetoric for multiple audiences. Internationally, such exchanges can destabilize markets, influence alliances, and provoke shifts in diplomatic strategy. Regionally, they can impact security calculations, military postures, and the balance of power among neighboring nations. Domestically, leaders use rhetoric to consolidate support, reinforce legitimacy, and frame narratives that serve political objectives. Understanding these layered effects allows observers to interpret statements not merely as threats or promises, but as deliberate interventions in a complex network of strategic relationships. Equally important is the role of historical patterns in informing our analysis. By situating current events within the continuum of past US Iran interactions, we can identify recurring strategies, cycles of escalation, and methods of negotiation that provide context for contemporary behavior. This historical awareness enables us to distinguish between rhetoric that is performative and rhetoric that signals genuine shifts in policy or intention. It also highlights the ways in which structural factors, sanctions, alliances, military capabilities limit the options available to both sides, shaping the strategic logic behind public statements. Finally, a critical approach empowers citizens to demand more from policymakers and media alike. By interrogating the assumptions underlying political rhetoric, questioning the narratives presented, and examining the consequences of actions, individuals can move from passive consumers of news to active participants in public discourse. Such analysis encourages the cultivation of informed, responsible perspectives that prioritize long term stability, economic justice, and human security over sensationalized conflict and reactionary politics